So a lot of my contemporaries have either retired or they've been thinking about their retirement, that it's coming up. So I thought, well, maybe I'll retire so that they don't have to. And they weren't really interested in this. They thought, well, no, you can't retire on my behalf as an experiment and then tell me about it. I want to know what it's like for myself, which seems fair enough. And of course, most of these men have spent a long time dreaming of retirement, not just a few months. And in some cases, not even a few years, but actually a few decades. And yet, those men I've known who have retired seem to have discovered that it's not quite as they thought it was. So I thought I might talk about that. I haven't retired because I'm not able to retire like some people, because of my own choices. And there are probably quite a number of people like me. But most of my contemporaries have lived through the post-war boom time. They've accumulated wealth and property, probably like no other generation before, and possibly like no other generation to come. And they've all gone into a state of non-working. They've left their jobs, which were by and large sort of either professional jobs of some sort or another. I suppose what we used to call office jobs, really. And let's talk about some of their experiences. You see, what concerns me is that idea that was first articulated by one of the first, by the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, who said that all of life's problems stem from the fact that a man cannot sit quietly on a chair in an empty room and do nothing. In theory, this should be quite a nice way to exist. Just to sit quietly, in contemplation, if you like, without any of the normal pressures, without any of the demands, without a sense of kind of ambition. And in a way, I suppose that's what a lot of people think of when they come to retirement. But Pascal and many other philosophers have said that this is not really something that's possible. It is not possible to stop entirely doing things or something. Now, of course, we will talk about whether we replace one thing with another thing which is more pleasurable. But maybe it's even more complicated than that. Schopenhauer was someone else who talked about man either being in a state of suffering. Now, you could say that working is, well, it's not suffering, is it? But there could be a form of pain because you feel that there is something you would rather be doing. This can lead to frustration and resentment. And there are other issues, of course. So Schopenhauer said, you're either in a state of suffering or you're in a state of boredom. Now, you can expand this a little bit because you can talk about the fact that this explains a little bit why people often require drama. They want drama. They want everything around them to be in a state of near crisis. And you can see this if you look at YouTube videos generally that are commentating on, they're doing political analysis. You'll see a lot of them are things like civil war is coming, it's the end of the West, democracy has failed. I mean, those are just some kind of obvious examples, but I'm sure you've seen it. It has to be dramatic. Soap operas, which on the face of it are sort of a commentary on real life as it progresses, and you have relationships and breakups and and you get involved in situations with other people. And but if you actually look at an episode of a soap opera, I mean, in the UK that would be EastEnders, or Coronation Street, or one of the many others, you will see that of course it's very high on drama, and that's because we want drama. And so because we know that drama in our own lives is kind of has consequences, some of which are very unpleasant, we like to have drama but kind of one step removed through TV. But anyway, so we're either in suffering or in a state of boredom. Blaise Pascal says that man cannot sit still in quiet contemplation. Well, let's have a look at some of these examples. Got an example, a friend of mine who dreamt of retiring for years and years, and he worked for about 30 years plus in IT, and he actually counted down, he was on social media, still is, he counted down the days to his retirement, and he started about 3-4 years ago, and it got closer and closer and closer. And he was retiring with his wife, who was retiring not quite at the same time. She actually retired 6 months ahead of him. And she actually moved to a new residence that they were going to live in their retirement. And actually this guy was living in Los Angeles. Eventually the day came. You know, there was the office party, literally the cleaning of the desk, and off he went. And he had been anticipating this day for many years. Now, within 6 months of his retirement, he had already started an online sort of trinket, not really antiques, but sort of trinket shop. So he used to go around markets. He was actually now living abroad. He was going around these foreign markets and finding little trinkets and then putting them online. He was also dabbling a little bit in sort of trying to do some online kind of consultancy thing. I'm not quite sure what it was, but again, you know, this is on top of all the DIY and the gardening that was taking place. And he was busier than ever. He was inventing projects on a daily and weekly business. And that finally he actually started applying for other work. He didn't need the money. He had dreamed of freedom. He had planned to just sort of be in a state of stasis, hiking maybe, reading, you know, those kind of things. But he ended up being busier than ever, and in the end he took another job. It wasn't in the same field. He didn't need the money, but it was work. And within 6 months, he had failed to retire. And I suspect, and he kind of said the same, that he felt he'd made a mistake stopping at 61. So, yeah, well, there's one story. I've also got another friend who was working in marketing and had worked in marketing for about 35 years and had accumulated enough to take early retirement, which he did. He detested his work. He detested it for 30 years, to be honest. He was commuting into London, and he used to complain of being bone tired on a daily basis. He was exhausted. I mean, he could barely get in to the office on some days. Anyway, he finally made it to the end. And I think quite early, at about 58 58, something like that, 56 even, 57, something like that. He was able to retire quite early. And he had plans, but none of them came into fruition. In some ways, he kind of deteriorated. He lived alone. He'd always been interested, for example, in computer games. And he played one computer game specifically. But he was now in retirement, free to play as many hours as he wanted. And after about a couple of years of retirement, where he hadn't really done anything, he was playing for 8 to 12 hours a day. He was now in his early 60s, probably 12 hours a day. He was playing it till 4 in the morning. He'd lost all his sleep pattern. He was sleeping throughout the day and in strange chunks. So 3 hours here, 2 hours there. He was getting up to play his video games. And it wasn't really the sort of life, again, that he was expecting or had anticipated. He was leaving the house less and less. The other example I've got is a friend of mine who was obsessed with golf. Now, I wonder whether or not this is a better way to think about retirement if we assume that it's impossible to do nothing, that we immediately have to fill that void for all sorts of reasons. Now, there is a physical reason we need to continue inventing projects for ourselves. That's because we have a will of some sort and we need to kind of fuel it. There are also psychological reasons. For example, it might be that your identity is caught up with your with how constructive you are, and that very quickly you can feel your sort of identity crumbling because you're not actually putting it together with work and projects, maybe something like that. But this guy, he also retired quite early, and as I said, he'd been obsessed with golf. Now, when he retired, he spent every day on the golf course. And I suppose that this is an example of where retirement kind of works, because he was replacing one activity, work, with another activity, golf. But that other activity was something that to him was obviously much more pleasurable, leisurely, enjoyable. But not everybody kind of has a sort of obsession that they can't wait to sort of practice 24 hours a day, 7 days a week immediately after retirement. So, it's difficult. Anyway, they're just 3 examples. There are many more, but I think those cover the sort of main areas that I think you have to be a bit careful of before you get too excited about retiring and start dreaming about what it's going to be like, because you don't necessarily understand just how frightening the sort of void of nothingness, of doing very little, of just sitting in quiet contemplation is. Now, my advice to anybody who wants to do that is to realise that it's not natural just to sit in quiet contemplation and do very little. It might feel like it when you get your week holiday or something, but to do it without an end in sight, I think is quite frightening. So my advice would be that you need to work at it, actually. You need to practice it, rather like a Buddhist would practice Zen on a daily basis. To think that it will all come to you, I think is probably not true. And again, there are also certain types of activity that you can kind of fill this new retirement void with. One is called telic, the other one is called atelic. What do they mean? Well, basically they mean that one of these activities is goal driven, and that's what we're used to, and that's a very powerful and natural phenomenon. And I think that the idea is that try and replace those type of activities with activities that are much more sort of in the moment. A classic example of this would be gardening. Now, of course, you do have very small goals sometimes in gardening, but generally the seasons turn, and there's always kind of this maintenance work to do throughout the seasons, whether it be planting in spring or whether it be raking the leaves in autumn. And this is why a lot of people, I think, are attracted to gardening after they've retired. And it's not because everybody has green fingers. I think it's more to do with it being a really hyper-appropriate way of filling the void. It's never ending. Something always needs doing. And of course, in the book Candide travels the world looking for the meaning of life, if you like, looking for purpose, only at the end of the book to come back to where he started and realizing that, and I quote pretty closely, the only sensible thing to do is to tend your own garden. Now, you could say that he was saying that using garden as a metaphor, to tend to your own affairs and not worry about too much about the world. But actually, I don't think it was entirely a metaphor. I think actually tending your garden is a fantastic way that many people find a form of purpose and an activity after retirement. I think men find it much more difficult, or I'm not sure, but I suspect men find it more difficult than women in this area, by the way, to retire, for lots of reasons. I mean, men's identity is often much more aligned with their work. That's one thing. Secondly, I think that women generally have much better social connections than men, even into later life. And that's really important. And I think that they have a resilience to boredom to some extent. And I think men physically can't handle it. So we come back to Blaise Pascal. And remember, he said that all of the problems of the world come from the fact that men can't sit quietly on a chair in an empty room. And if you look politically at the moment at these, the profile of the men who are responsible for all sorts of ideological and weird reasons for mass slaughter, often for territorial ambition, or for strange religious ideological reasons, demonizing the other, rather like the fascists did in Mussolini and Hitler, then you realize that there's a huge danger also on a geopolitical scale of men who can't sit quietly with themselves, but must engage on a vast level with extending their will into the world around them. Just like the retiree cannot sit quietly, as he had planned to do for decades. I will sit under a tree. I will have a glass of white wine. I will read a book. I will walk through the meadows. I will go back to my love of photography. That kind of thing. And they can't do it. They can't do it. They have to invent bigger and bigger projects, almost going back to work. Yeah. So I want to leave you with a couple of stories. I have a friend of mine called Paul. Or I had a friend of mine called Paul. He was about to retire 5 years before that date. He was a builder. 5 years before that date, he bought 3 properties in Portugal, 3 small cottages. They were very cheap. They were about 12,000 each, I think. This is going back a little time. And he bought 2 that he was going to do up and rent out. And he bought 1 that he was going to live in. And he had planned his retirement. He used to dream about it. He used to tell me he was going to sit there with his Peroni beer and collect those rents. So he spent the 5 years doing up these properties. He used to drive in my old van, actually. He used to drive all the way from northern France to Portugal and would be there for 6 weeks or something doing it up. And then he'd come back to work where we were living in France. And you know how this story's going to end. He was completing the project. He was very close. 5 years of physical labour. He was diagnosed with a cancer, prostate cancer. And what happened to him is what seems to happen to everybody I know who's got cancer. They struggle for 2 years and they're dead. Now, obviously, some people can recover if you can have surgery, but this was something that they use chemotherapy. Everyone I know has had the kind of long chemotherapy session. So another friend of mine, exactly the same situation. He lived in Singapore. He'd bought a farm in Sri Lanka, a tea farm, I think of about 45 acres. And he had reconstructed a beautiful wooden villa on that land, and he was preparing to retire there. And this had taken up much of the last 7 or 8 years of his life. He was wealthy, relatively wealthy, and he didn't like it. He was bored of his job. He'd been doing it for decades. He was a shipbroker. And what he did was he decided that he would retire to this Sri Lankan farm, but he never could do it. I used to say to him, I said, Dave, you've got more money than you need. Why don't you retire? I would have retired if I'd have had his money. I would not have done it. He used to get in that 35-degree heat in Singapore, and he used to drive his little old classic Mercedes right into the centre to that office every fucking day. Oh, excuse my language. Every day. He didn't need to do it. He was what? Late 50s. He'd been doing it for 20, 30 years. I said, stop. He couldn't stop. I once asked him, I said, why can't you stop? You don't like it. You don't want to do it. You dream of retirement. Why won't you stop? He actually said to me, he said, it's fear. You know, it was always, another month's pay packet, another month's pay packet. He didn't know how to stop, really. But he was kind of, there was going to become a point where he couldn't do it anymore, He was now 60. And he was talking about it all the time. And I guess he would have got there. But he got cancer of the esophagus about 2 years ago. And the treatment for it was surgical at the beginning and then chemotherapy. He had 2 or 3 rounds of chemotherapy. The chemotherapy killed him. He couldn't function on that chemotherapy. For some reason, it was far too destructive for him. He went into a hospice and he died 2 years after his diagnosis. He didn't have anybody to leave his money to except an older brother. And his older brother had to kind of unravel his estate. He had a yacht at Chichester Harbour. He had never married. There was no one else. He didn't really have any friends. He had this Sri Lankan farm, and he had a couple of apartments which he owned, which he'd bought, which had never been lived in, nor even let out. Again, plans that were unfulfilled. And it took him 6 months or a year to kind of unravel this whole thing. He didn't need to be working. He didn't want to be working. he couldn't stop. And yet there are those that do stop and realise that for some reason they've made a mistake, that they can't not work. Now I'm thinking, I would love to be in that situation. Why can't it be me that's got the ability to retire? Because I really could do nothing. But I probably couldn't. I would probably end up doing something. I don't know what. Although I would fight it hard. I would fight hard to exist in a place of no ambition. I would not hopefully search for purpose and meaning, but just would be able to sit quietly with my last few years and sort of prepare for infinite oblivion. I don't really want to sort of drop dead or get diagnosed with cancer while I'm in the middle of a stupid project. There's something wrong with that juxtaposition. I must paint the shed. Oh dear, I'm dead for eternity. Anyway, there you go. There are my views on retirement.